Hello and welcome to the first of the Logical English lessons. If you want to know why I created these and indeed who I am and what I'm all about, please go to the website that you can see on the screen, www.logicalenglish.com. Oh, by the way, at this point, if you haven't already done so, again, please go to the website and download a study guide. There are study guides for all of the lectures, and this will allow you to get so much more from all of these lessons. So if you've done that, let's begin. We're going to start simply. I know it might be far too simple for some or many of you, but it helps if we all begin on the same page, as it were. So we're going to start simply. We're going to gradually build on top of that, build and build and build, and we're going to see various aspects of grammar, and we're going to see all of the tenses laid out and how they work, and we're going to gradually build to 3 golden rules. For students, you'll be able to apply these to all of your writing and speaking before you've produced it. You'll also be able to retroactively apply it to your writing and speaking to check for errors. For teachers, you'll be able to supply many of your students with the answer to their questions and giving them reasons. And for so many students, that's a critical thing, to be able to understand why things happen in English. So, let's begin simply. So, over the coming 4 lectures, if we're going to talk about the things that we need to talk about and to be able to understand them clearly, I feel it's pretty important that we all use and understand the same terminology. So, what we're going to do first is I'd like you to take a look at this sentence. The very fat cat is walking happily on an incredibly high wall. I don't think that should pose any problems to any of you. I'm sure you all understand that. But I want you to do a few things with this sentence, just so we're all on the same page. I'd like you to identify the nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and articles in this sentence. And I'd also like you to identify what's the subject, what's the object, and what's the verb structure in this sentence. If you want to, pause things now and work on that. Let's look at the nouns first of all. Well, there are 2 nouns. We've got cat, and we've got wall. Now, let's start with the building blocks. What are nouns? Well, nouns are metaphors for things. They when you can't find the physical thing to literally hold in front of you, these words stand for those things, whether those things are real or not real. And many would argue that this is the beginning of all language anyway. So I want to take you back to the origins of language, maybe about 100,000 years ago on some prehistoric field, and I want to introduce you to 2 cavemen. There we go, there they are. If our nice friendly caveman on the left wanted to convey the idea of a chicken to the caveman on the right, well, he'd have to, before language, find an actual physical chicken. And there it is. So now there's no need for language because you can actually find the thing that you're trying to convey the idea of. However, if he wasn't able to find an actual physical chicken, he'd have to do something else. And that's somehow produce a metaphor for what a chicken is. He'd have to create a word. And what's he going to do? He's going to have to invent it, and he'll say to his friend, chicken. And really, that's how nouns begin. They have to be invented at some point, and that's what happens. Many people would argue that that is the root of all language. So, We're going to skip over the verbs for the moment. They're a complicated and large subject, and we'll come back to them in just a moment. But let's go straight on to the adjectives. What are the adjectives in this sentence? I hope you were able to find that we've got fat and we've got high. So what's the job of an adjective? I hope you can see up here that fat is describing cat and high is describing wall. So the job of an adjective is used to describe nouns. Now, in some other languages, the adjectives might come before the noun, they might come after the noun, but in English, this is, I suppose, the first logical point. The adjective always comes before the noun that it's describing. You can see up here, what kind of cat? It's a fat cat. What kind of wall? It's a high wall. The adjective's always coming first. So let's move on to the adverbs. What adverbs can you see here? Well, I hope you'll agree with me that you can see very, happily, and incredibly. So what are the job of adverbs? Well, they're doing a few things here, in fact. They do a few things in English. You can see that here the word very is describing the word fat. How fat? Well, it's very fat. So the first thing they're doing they're used to describe adjectives. The other thing they're doing, you can see here, is the word happily is describing the word walking. So they're also being used to describe verbs. Another thing they also do, which is often forgotten, and it's not in fact used in this sentence, is adverbs can also be used to describe other adverbs. English has a lot of leeway with where you can position adverbs. They can go in many places in the sentence. But let's keep things simple at the moment and just say that if they're describing an adjective, they'll come before the adjective, like very fat, incredibly high. If they're describing a verb, it'll come immediately. It'll often come immediately after the verb that it's describing. Walking. How is it walking? Walking happily. So those are the adverbs. Moving on to the prepositions. A subject that I know strikes fear into a lot of students' hearts. Well, not only students' hearts, teachers as well. What prepositions can you see in this sentence? I'm sure you know and you can see the word on. Where is it walking? In the wall? No. By the wall? No. On the wall. So you can see the relationship between the cat and the wall is expressed in this preposition on. And in fact, that is their job. They are used to show relationships between noun, and I'm going to introduce a word here, noun phrases. Now, the difference between a noun and a noun phrase is that a noun phrase might consist of many words. For example, in this sentence, the very fat cat is one idea. There's one noun, cat. But the idea of the very fat cat is what we would call a noun phrase. And in this case, the very fat cat on an incredibly high wall, that preposition is showing us their relationship. But here's some of the bad news. How many prepositions do you think there are in English? I'm fearful of telling you, but unfortunately there are 126 of the things. I promise you it's going to take a lifetime of learning English to be perfect in all of them. It's just extremely unlikely to happen. However, if you get one wrong, don't worry about it too much. Try and get it correct the next time. If you get it right, give yourself a big, a big round of applause, because they're not easy things. So what are the articles in this sentence? I hope you can see we've got the word the, and we've got the word an. I'm not going to go into article usage here. It's actually an extremely large subject. If you have them in your language, then, count yourself lucky. If you don't, for example, if you're a Korean speaker, a Japanese speaker, a Russian speaker, then, yeah, they're going to be tough. It's an entirely separate subject, which we'll come on to at some later point. We're going to come back to the verbs here. What are the verbs you can see in this sentence? Hopefully, you can clearly see the word, well, we've got walking there, haven't we? There's one other one. What's the other one? We've also got the word is. Now, verbs are often described as doing words. Words which describe an activity, describe some kind of act. And at this point, we're going to look into verbs in a little bit more depth. In the sentence we've got here on the screen, as you can see, there are two verbs. Which one do you think is the main verb? Well, hopefully you're all guessing correctly when you're saying that walking is the main verb. It's the verb which carries some kind of meaning. So what about the word is? Well, you all know that it's the verb to be. But what's it doing there? We've got the main verb, walking. The word is, in this sentence, is acting as what we would call an auxiliary verb. Now, verbs can be thought of in many different ways. For the purposes of today's lesson, we're going to categorize them, we're going to put them into three different categories. We're going to have modal verbs, a subject which we're going to come to later. We've got main verbs, as we've already seen, things like, well, the example we saw is walking, so the base form being walk. We've got walk, run, talk, think, love, discuss, work, make. And of course they can be in their different past and present participle forms as well. So we've got, it could be walk, walked, walked in the case of regular verbs. It might be something like take, took, taken in the case of an irregular verb. And there are also these things called auxiliary verbs. Now I need to be careful with my spelling here because it's a word that I often misspell. I often spell it with two L's. So auxiliary verbs. This is a subject which is often really badly understood by students, mainly because it's really badly understood by teachers as well. But it is a subject that must be understood quite, pretty deeply and accurately in order to improve your accuracy, but also in order to get those higher scores on things like on exams like IELTS and Cambridge exams. Now, how many different auxiliary verbs are there? Hopefully you're coming up with the answer 3. Can you name what they are? Well, we've got the auxiliary verb do, we've got the auxiliary verb have, and we've got the auxiliary verb be. And something that is incredibly important is to understand precisely what their jobs actually are. The word do, for example, has 2, and you could argue 3 jobs. Let's look at those jobs. The first job is, well, it creates what I'll call grammatically simple questions. So, for example, we say, do you like cats? Hundreds of years ago, we really did in English used to say, like you cats. But we started to use the word do to make the sentence more clear. However, for language learners, it does make things a little bit more complicated, I'm afraid. But we use the word do to create questions. Its other main job it creates negatives. So with the question, do you like cats? We've got the answer, the negative answer, no, I do not like cats. And just like questions, hundreds of years ago, we used to say, I like cats not, or I like not cats. But for purposes of clarity among native speakers, the auxiliary verb do was used, started to be used to create negatives. It does have a possible third job, and that's it creates emphasis. More particularly, this is used for speaking and more particularly used for arguments. So, for example, following on our conversation, you don't like cats. Well, if the other person actually does, they might say, I do like cats, with that auxiliary verb do being used to create an emphatic structure there. So those are the 3 jobs of the auxiliary verb do. The auxiliary verb have, well, it just has one job. It creates perfect tenses. If you're not clear at the moment what we mean by perfect tenses, it's something we're going to be coming on to towards the end of this lesson. Finally, the auxiliary verb be. Again, this one has 2 jobs. Firstly, it creates continuous tenses. I'm sure you know what they are, but just like perfect tenses, if you're not quite sure, we'll be coming on to them a little bit later. Its other job is it creates the passive voice. Something that students often hate, but I'm going to encourage you to think that it's actually a lot simpler than you think, and just like the other things, we'll be coming to that a little bit later. As I say, a deep knowledge of these 3 auxiliary verbs and their jobs, it's not really up for debate. It's essential to increase your accuracy in English, and essential for improving those IELTS and Cambridge scores. If you want a little bit of practice with these, there is an exercise in the study guide accompanying these lessons. Just go to the website if you haven't already to grab that free study guide. So let's come back to the remaining questions on the screen. In this sentence, what's the subject? I hope you were able to see that we've got the subject up here. The very fat cat. That's the subject of the sentence. What about the object? We've got an incredibly high wall. You can, if you wish, because of the nature of this verb, which we'll come to later, or rather in a later lecture, you could also include this preposition either as part of the object or as part of the, well, what's remaining. Yep, indeed, that's the verb structure. And again, we can probably include the word, the adverb in that as well. So we've got the subject, we've got the verb, and the verb structure, and we've got the object. And this leads us on to, I suppose, one of the most critical rules in English. In fact, it's probably so critical that I've not actually included it in my 3 golden rules, which we'll come to right at the end. And it also creates one of our first high-level problems that I often see in high-level students. And it's also a problem which many teachers have a great deal of problem spotting, because it can be quite, well, I suppose, a seductive problem. And I'd like to highlight that problem here. Take a look at this sentence. Let me read it out for you. It's a beautiful sentence. One day I saw, while I was walking in the park on a sunny afternoon with the sun beating down on my head and the birds, multicoloured like so many musical rainbows, were singing from the tops of the gum trees. Poetic, magical, wonderful. However, I hope you're beginning to see, both students and teachers alike, that there's something not quite right with this sentence. Take a look at it in the study guide and see if you can spot what the problem might be. Which fundamental rule of English is it breaking? Can you answer that question? Ask yourself this question. What's the subject? We've got one day. Okay, one day is expressing a time. That's a time clause. Okay, there we go. We've got I. We've got the subject there. The verb structure. Okay, well, it's immediately next. We say I saw. So we've got the verb structure there. We've got past simple verb. I saw. And we've got one. Well, in fact, can you tell me, what did I see? Oh, no, okay. No, and did I see the birds? No, that's just and the birds. So that's a sort of a separate thing. This is describing the birds, just telling us what the birds were. What did I actually see? This sentence is missing something. Be sure to remember that English needs subject plus verb, or verb structure, and indeed that subject might be a noun phrase, it might be several words, but it's still subject plus a verb structure plus an object. And this sentence, I can't really call it a sentence, okay, it's got a full stop at the end, but it's not a complete sentence. It's what we call a fragment sentence, and it's missing its object. But now, well, let me call a small point of order. We all know, and many teachers teach, remember, subject, verb, object, that's how it must be. But there are another couple of options in English, let's be honest. It is also possible simply to have subject followed by verb, depending on which verb you choose. Some verbs absolutely require a direct object. I saw my friend, for example. However, if you were to choose a different verb, I walk. Do you walk? Yeah, you walk. We walk. The words, simply 2 words, we walk, subject, verb, is enough because that verb, walk, doesn't require a direct object. There is another option as well, which is subject plus verb plus adjective. If we simply think of it is good, well, then we've got a complete sentence. Good is acting effectively like the object, but it's not a noun phrase in doing so. It's just an adjective. well, I say just it's an adjective. So there could also be he smells nice, she looks great, etc., etc., etc. So please, 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 let's not have any more, albeit extremely high level, and this is the kind of mistake I would often see for someone trying to impress an IELTS exam. It's long, it's complicated, but it is not complete, and it would not receive reasonable scores. Much better to keep your sentences tight. I saw something. I saw my friend. And then you know it's completely 100% accurate because you've used the subject, verb, object rule. Please don't forget it. Now, in just a moment, we're going to be coming on to discussing and laying out all of the tenses that exist in English. It's not often, in fact, I've never seen that happen elsewhere. But before we do that, I want to discuss the other side of verbs. We've discussed auxiliary verbs. Now I want to take a look at main verbs, and more to the point, what we're going to call them. Here's what I'd like you to do. So far we've seen in the previous, in our sentence earlier, we saw is walking. We agreed that is an auxiliary verb in that sentence, and walking was the main verb. But what do we call that kind of verb? And indeed other kinds of verbs. If you take a look at these words here, we've got to take, took, taken, taking, and taking. Yeah, I know there are two of the same there. Can you think what we call those things? Let's begin with the second one down, take. Well, there's a lot of confusion about naming these things. Confusion caused by books, caused by teachers. Here I'm going to use what I believe to be the best method, the best naming system. Take, we're just going to call that the base form. What about took? You know, we've got take, took, taken, right? Took. We're going to call that the past form. Taken. For some reason, loads of students seem to know this one, and I'm sure you do as well. We'll call that one, number 3, the past participle. And indeed, as I just referred to, we often know these as 1, 2, and 3. But in the sentence we saw at the beginning, we saw the word walking, like this word taking. What's that? Now, I'm sure many of you at the moment are thinking, oh, that's a gerund. Well, no, not as a verb, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. We in fact call that when it's with the auxiliary verb to be, in other words, creating the continuous tense, as in is walking. We know this as the present participle. Please, please, please avoid calling this a verb plus ing or something along those lines. It's not. The name for it is a present participle when it's a verb. So in fact, I think we should really call them 1, 2, 3, and 4. But for some reason, 1, 2, and 3 has stuck. We've got 2 remaining. I'll come back to the second taking in a moment. First of all, this to take. Hopefully, you're able to recognize it as an infinitive. And again, please, this, for example, take is not the base, base form without the to. This is not the infinitive is not the base form. It's not the base form plus to. It's infinitive is always with to take. And one of the first issues we see is that this is a noun. It is not a verb. I'll prove that to you in just a moment, because it comes to our second, or our final missing one here as well. Taking. What's taking? Previously, with the present participle, many of you undoubtedly probably thought it was a gerund. Well, let's call this one a gerund. But, like an infinitive, let's also state that this is a noun. To take, infinitives and gerunds really should not appear on any list of verbs. But Craig, can you prove that? I hear you say. Well, let's take a look at an example. I don't know about you, but I like cats. What do you like? You like music? Yeah, me too. I like the sun. Oh, absolutely. You know, I live in Australia and that's a nice climate for me. I like the sun. Also, I like to walk in the park, especially on a nice sunny day. I'm sure we all do. I like to walk in the park. Do you like to walk in the park? Another thing I like to do, I like listening to music. If we take the sentence, I like cats, what's the subject? I, right? I is the subject. We know there's only one verb here because there's no auxiliary verb. I like is the main verb. And the object, we've got cats. The countable noun, cats. 1 cat, 2 cats, 3 cats. We've got the uncountable noun, music. We've got a noun phrase here, which, you know, including an article, the definite article. I like the sun. The sun is acting as a noun phrase, as the object in this sentence. And then here we've got something interesting. To create an object, we're using here the infinitive. And an object is not a verb. An object is a noun. So we've got to walk in the park as quite a long noun phrase here, beginning with an infinitive. Another possibility, we've got listening to music. We're using the gerund here for the same kind of reason, creating a nice long noun phrase beginning with a gerund. So if cats is a noun, then to walk is a noun, and listening is a noun in this case. We can even flip it round. Let's try that. We've got music is nice. What else is nice? I don't know. Ice cream. Ice cream is nice. But now let's try using these infinitives and gerunds. It works. To walk in the park is nice. And I'm sure you're one step ahead of me here. Listening to music is nice. Again, we're using an infinitive and a gerund here, this time not as an object, but as the beginning of a subject and a noun phrase. So hopefully you can see here that infinitives and gerunds, they are absolutely not verbs. They are a way that we convert verbs into nouns. When we're talking about verbs, we only have four forms, not like the multiples of four, you know, I think some 18 forms or so that exist in French and Spanish. Many more than that in Portuguese. We just have the 4 in English. We've got the base form, the past participle, and the present participle. And combining those with various auxiliary verbs that we saw earlier, we can start to create our various tenses in English. So, let's start taking a look at those. So now it's time to move on to discuss some of the tenses. In fact, all of the tenses. But before we look at English, I want you to think about your own language. How many tenses does your language have? Take a moment to think about that. I'm by no means any kind of expert in your various languages, but to the best of my knowledge, I would say that I think French has something like 18. Spanish, I believe, has something similar. Portuguese, any Portuguese speakers out there, you might be shocked to find out that, well, your language has, I believe, something like 27 tenses. On the other hand, we've got, the Japanese speakers out there. You might be thinking, 27? No, Japanese, we only need 6. And I think similar for Korean, if there are any Korean speakers out there. So what about English? How many tenses does English have? The answer here, as we'll come on to see, is 12. So, let me settle some of the arguments for a moment. Some of the, for example, Japanese speakers out there might be saying, see, English is complicated. English is more complicated than Japanese. Japanese, we only need 6. English needs 12. That's crazy. Let's start addressing some of the differences between our languages. I want to introduce 2 shapes to you. Maybe you know them, maybe you don't. On the left, we have a cone, with the adjective being conical. And on the right, we have a cylinder, with the adjective being cylindrical. Now in English, and indeed in many European languages, Portuguese, French, Spanish, etc., we might say something, if we're on the phone to our friend and we're about to walk into a room that is shaped like a cone, when we walk into the room, we might say to our friend, "Hi, John. John, yeah, it's Craig here. I am standing in a conical room. I am standing in a conical room. Okay, John, I'm going to move into the next room now. And so now, John, I am standing in a cylindrical room." There's quite a lot of words there. I am standing in, that preposition linking the noun phrases I and room, in a, and then we've got an adjective, conical, describing room. I am standing in a conical room. These are tense-based languages, but many languages, for example Japanese, Korean, Russian, use what we call a case-based system. And indeed English used to use a case-based system back 1,000 years ago when it was just beginning. But we stopped using it in favour of things like prepositions and greater number of tenses. But what is a case-based system? Well, this might be similar to your language, this might not be, but in a case-based system, the person might say, "Hi, John, I stand." That's how it would translate, but the word stand might be different depending on the shape of the room. So I stand-ee, I stand-are. And if it's in the past, for example, I stand-ee-oo, I stand-are-oo. If it's happening now, I stand-ee-ing, I stand-eyeing. So there won't be auxiliary verbs, there might not be adjectivized nouns. It's just the word stand which would tell you whether it's the shape of the room, whether it's inside or outside, whether it's big or small, hot or cold, past, present, future. And in my opinion, because that's the way my brain is wired being an English speaker, it seems to be simpler to use tenses rather than cases. If you're a Japanese or Korean speaker or a Russian speaker, I'm sure you disagree, but those are the fundamental differences. It's kind of up to you guys to decide, well, which system do you believe is simpler? In fact, as I said, English does have it does have a history of cases, of using cases, but 1,000 years ago, but we do still have some of them. I want to give you an example here. I like you, so hopefully you like I, right? I like you, you like I. Well, you know as well as I do that it doesn't work like that. In this first clause, what's the subject? I. Verb, like, and you is the object. But now when we spin those round, when we're using you as the subject, the concept of I, the concept of I-ness, if you like, now is no longer I, but you know as well as I do that we use the word me. So when I is the subject, it's I. But when I is the object, it's me. So depending on the position in the sentence, the word changes, and that is just a little bit of old historical case structure for you. It's almost all gone in English. Now we're completely tense-based. So let's have a look at those tenses right now. So we're going to move on now to really where my personal deeper understanding of English really began. And it began with a student many years ago who asked me, Craig, how many tenses are there in English? Now we've answered that question already. We now know that it's 12. But the point is, I couldn't answer the question about which I was very ashamed. My colleagues couldn't answer the question. My boss couldn't answer the question, and I couldn't find any books with the answer to the question anywhere. So that made me sit down with a pen and piece of paper and figure out the number of tenses and to list them and to see their differences so I could start to see this language as logically as possible. So let's replicate that process now and start listing the tenses. If I ask you to name a tense, well, you'll probably begin with, like most people, the present simple tense. And of course, if we've got present simple, there's past simple. Well, we've got past simple, present simple. We've also got future simple. I tell you what, while we're at this point, let's get some examples of these. So present simple, let's say we'll use the same verb that we've already been using. I take the bus. When? Well, of course, we're using present simple now, so we'll talk about always. We'll talk about a repeated action, something that's always true. I take the bus every day. We've got the present simple there. So now let's go into the past simple. Well, what's the past form of take? Number 2 form. I took the bus. But now not every day. Well, it could be, but let's change it to a specific point in the past. I took the bus yesterday. And now let's move on to the future simple. We've got the past, I took the bus yesterday. Present, I take the bus every day. Future simple. Now we're going to use another verb. Some people would call it an auxiliary verb, and in many ways it is. We'll come to exactly what it is in a little moment, but we're going to use the word will. I will take the bus. When? Well, tomorrow. I will take the bus tomorrow. And so there we've got the three simple tenses. Moving on from the simple, well, we've got present. The next one that many people mention will be continuous. Present continuous. An example of that, let's have... now, which auxiliary verb are we going to be using to create the continuous tenses? We're going to be using the auxiliary verb to be, but of course we're going to conjugate it with the subject. So I am, and then we're going to be using this present participle. I am taking the bus. And when? Now. Imagine that you're on the phone to your friend and you're saying, hey, what are you doing? And you say, well, I'm taking the bus right now. And then if we shift that into the past, we don't have to touch the present participle at all. All we need to do is change the auxiliary verb, am, to its past form was. I was taking the bus. Well, now when are we going to talk about? When I saw you. So two things happening at the same time. We have the instant in time when I saw you, and the ongoing action, taking the bus. And to shift it into the future, well, again, we're going to use this word will. We're going to use the auxiliary verb to be, just like previously. And we're going to be leaving that present participle exactly the same. I will be taking the bus, but now we need to know when at a point in the future. Let's say at 6 o'clock tonight. Tonight, this evening, whenever you consider 6 o'clock to be. So we've got the present, the past continuous, the present continuous, and the future continuous. I hope you see a pattern forming here. Another 3 continuous tenses. So what's the next one that we have? We mentioned this tense a little bit earlier. It's the perfect tense. What perfect tense is, as we'll see. So present perfect. And do you remember which auxiliary verb we're going to be using with the perfect tenses? Yeah, that's right. We're going to be using the auxiliary verb to have. So, I have. And now we're going to be using the past participle. Take, took, taken. I have taken the bus. And when? Well, any time before now, basically. So let's say, I have taken the bus before. Yeah. Have you? Have you taken the bus before? Yeah, I have taken the bus before as well. So that's the present perfect, because the auxiliary verb have is in its present form. Now, if we change it to the past perfect, we have, what's the past form of have? Had. I had taken the bus. Well, now let's change it to before another event in the past. Before, I don't know, let's say before starting school, for example. So, in the past, I started school. We've got this preposition before, following it. Is it what is that one? That's a gerund. Well done. So we've got before starting school. That happened at one point in the past. And before that happened, well, I had taken the bus. So we've got the past perfect. Now we have a pretty tricky one. I won't go into full depth about how to use it right now. But we can start to logically construct it. If I say future, you say, that's right, will. If I say perfect, you say, okay, have. I will have taken the bus. And let's say by 6 o'clock tonight. Now all that means is that maybe I'll take the bus at 3 o'clock, maybe I'll take the bus at 4 o'clock, maybe I'll take the bus at 5:55, 5:59 even. All we know is that before this stated time arrives, this has happened, or in this case, will have happened. So there we have the past perfect, present perfect, and future perfect. And now the final set of tenses, and this tends to be an absolute headache for many students. But once again, we can logically create them. We have the perfect continuous, and forgive me for abbreviating them there, just to perf cont, but space is an issue, of course. So we have past perfect continuous, present perfect continuous, and future perfect continuous. Let's get some examples of those. Let's start with present perfect continuous. Well, we've got the subject, I. I say perfect, you say, yeah, have. But now I say continuous and you start saying the auxiliary verb to be. So have been, and now of course, being the continuous tense, we need the present participle. I have been taking the bus for 30 minutes. So here we're focusing on a process that started in the past, continuing up to now, and will probably continue into the future. And if we've got the present perfect continuous here, well, let's shift it into the past. What are we going to be changing? We've got this verb structure, have been taking. We know from previous that we're not going to change this taking part. So we're going to focus here. Now here we've got two auxiliary verbs. We're actually just going to change the first one. I had been taking the bus, let's say for 30 minutes. Where shall I put this? By 6 o'clock. I'll put that for 30 minutes in as well. I had been taking the bus for 30 minutes by 6 o'clock. So now we're talking about the past. And if at 6 o'clock yesterday it was 30 minutes on the bus, well, what time did I start? What time did I get on the bus? About 5:30. It's a tricky tense, but I tell you what, possibly not as tricky as the next one. Finally, the future perfect continuous. Well, I say future, you say will, and now we're just going to leave have been taking as the same. I will have been taking the bus for 30 minutes. By 6 o'clock. And of course now we're talking about the future, so we're talking about tonight at 6 o'clock. Well, when did I start? When do I predict I will get on the bus? About 5:30, so that by 6 o'clock It's 30 minutes, me on the bus. And there we have our 12 tenses. And this is what we do in English. We've got past simple, past continuous, past perfect, past perfect continuous, present simple, present continuous, present perfect continuous, future simple, future continuous, future perfect, and future perfect continuous. They are the 12 tenses. There's no more, no fewer. And at this point in my research, many years ago, this is when I realized, oh my goodness, compared to many other languages, this really is an extremely logical language. There are 4 past tenses, 4 present, 4 future, or if you want to look at it another way, 3 simple, 3 continuous, 3 perfect continuous. And logically we can create them, and indeed that's our very next step. Okay then, I know it's been a long journey, I know there's been a lot of information to take in, but we are pretty close now to creating our 3 golden rules. And at this point I'll remind you, hopefully you've been using the downloadable study guides as well to help you. If you don't mind, I've simplified what we previously had. We've got all the tenses there, and we've got the examples of the verb structures. So we're going to start to notice a few things now, and we're going to begin with noticing this here. This word will. What kind of word is the word will? I mean, it's not a main verb, because the main verb in these sentences is taking, or take in some form. We know there are only 3 real auxiliary verbs in English, and it's not one of those. So can anyone tell me what it is? Hopefully you've come up with the answer that it is a modal verb. And what I'd like you to do is to think of some other modal verbs that you might have for me. I mean, we've got, in fact, let's go to this next slide here. I'll introduce Craig's modal stereo in just a moment, but what other modal verbs can you give me? We've already seen will. Any others? Well, hopefully you're coming up with will, could, can. Any others? Yep, let's keep going. May, might, shall, should, will, could, can, may, might, shall, should. Of course we've got ought to. What does ought to mean? Exactly the same as should, that's right. Let's create a sentence now with, I don't know, let's use the word can. Let's put it over here. I can write. Okay. Let's take a sentence with may. I may go. Let's make a sentence with should. I should do my homework, for example. Don't always do it, but I should do it. What I hope you're beginning to notice is that what comes immediately following are modal verbs. I can write. I may go. I should do. If we return to our list of verb forms that we saw earlier, we see that take is a base form, took, past form, etc., etc. If we return to our sentences, what does that show us? After the modal verbs, we've always got a base form. And this is going to create our very first golden rule. And as you can see, we've got some of them listed up here, and I hope you're completing these on your study guides. The first one, after a modal verb, can, should, may, might, must, etc., the next verb, which is normally the next word, is always a base form. So that is the first of our 3 golden rules. Something else I want you to notice about modal verbs, something that's quite strange about them, and this is where I'll start explaining my stereo. A student many years ago asked me a perfectly simple question, which is, Craig, why are they called modal verbs? And that question really left me scratching my head for a long time, until it occurred to me that if you forgive my age, this is an old 1980s stereo, but what different functions does it have? It can play cassettes, as you can see here. It can play CDs, and of course back here we've got an antenna allowing us to play the radio. And sitting on the front of that stereo, there's a nice big button that probably says something like mode on it. And the mode button allows you to change between these different functions. And that's when it occurred to me that, of course, these modal verbs are exactly the same. Each modal verb has has more than one function. To give you, I won't go into all, this is one of the most difficult things in English. I won't go into all of the examples now, but we'll take one example. For example, should. I should do my homework. Well, we're talking about an obligation, right? But let me give you another example. I'm in Australia. My sister's in the UK. It takes about 24 hours to arrive or to get to Australia from the UK. She left the UK about 23 hours ago. So she should be here in 1 hour. Now that's nothing to do with obligation, that's a prediction, right? An expectation. So we're using the modal verb, the same modal verb, in a different way, but it is still obeying our golden rule number 1, being followed by a base form. We'll return now to our list of tenses, and we've dealt with the modal verb will. We'll turn our attention to the auxiliary verb have. We now know that the word have is inextricably linked with perfect tenses. Whether it's in the past or the future, we've got had, have, had, have, and have again. And in the same way that you notice things about the modal verb will, let's start noticing about the auxiliary verb have. What is it always followed by? We've got had, taken, have taken, had been, have been, and hopefully here you're noticing that in each case it's being followed by, well, hold on, let's return to our verb list. In each case it's being followed by the past participle, number 3, right? You can see here, past participle, but they're all being, even the been is a past participle. So this allows us to create our second golden rule. And the second golden rule being, after the auxiliary verb have, and it doesn't matter what form that word have is, whether it's in the past, present or future, as long as it's an auxiliary verb, the next verb, which is normally the next word, is always a past participle. That brings us round to our rule number 3, and let's return to our tense list of tenses for that. We've got one more auxiliary verb to do here. And hopefully you can see that we've got the verb to be. We've got was, am, be, and then we've also got been, been. And what do you notice in each case? What's it being followed with? Once again, as we know from our verb list, it's being followed by a present participle. Let's just check our verb list for that. Yep, taking, that's our present participle. A little note to remember here, infinitives, don't forget please, infinitives and gerunds are not verbs, that's why I've not included them on this list. But yeah, we've got the present participle, taking, and so that brings us to our final rule. Our final rule being, after the auxiliary verb be, and again it doesn't matter what form that auxiliary verb be is in, the next verb, normally the next word, is, and now I've got to be a bit careful because it's not always, but is normally, and we'll see why in a moment, it's normally a present participle. Now, using these 3 rules, you should be able to rid yourself of a huge number of high-level errors, and teachers, you should be able to spot and then give reasons for your corrections. Let's move on to why this is normally, not always. It's a subject that many students and teachers don't like to learn or teach, but it's actually far simpler than many people realise. It's the subject of the passive voice. Now, if I write here be3, that's because we've got the auxiliary verb to be and verb form number 3, which you now know is the past participle. And so, for example, I was taken. We've got some form of the auxiliary verb to be in was, and we've got the past participle in taken. So it's easy to create the passive voice, but probably what is the biggest problem is, well, why do we use it? If you're a speaker of a European language, it's highly likely that you use it for the same reasons in your language, but not necessarily so for all learners. Let's look at our reasons why. Well, 1, we use it because we don't know what the subject is. Second reason we use it, we don't care. Third reason we use it is the subject is obvious. To give an example of these, if we take the sentence, the police arrested the boy, well, subject the police, main verb, and what we know that it's in the past simple tense, arrested, object the boy. But, who is it that always arrests people? It's always the police. So really there's no reason to mention the police. What would make far more sense, instead of the police arrested the boy, is to take the object, the boy, put it at the front of the sentence. So we've got the boy. Now we're going to be using the auxiliary verb in its past simple form, was, and 3, well, arrest, arrested, arrested. So arrest, it's a regular verb, so arrested is its third form, is its past participle. The boy was arrested, and now we have no particular need for the subject of the police. But if we want to, we could use the preposition by the police. But I would argue, because the subject of the police is obvious, there's no real reason to do that. And so, for these 3 reasons, we use the passive voice, which is why I say it's normally a present participle that follows the auxiliary verb to be, not always. So using these 3 golden rules, you're going to get out of a lot of problems, okay? And not only that, but keeping these 3 rules in your head, and a lot of what we've discussed up until now, it's going to make the lectures that follow this an awful lot easier as we discuss things like relative clauses and the conditionals, etc., etc. Let's take a look at an example sentence in which you can use the 3 golden rules that we've just learned to correct some of the errors. It's a good example of a sentence from an intermediate student, or intermediate or high level student. Let's see. If I had saw you at the party, I would to have say hello. If I had saw you at the party, I would to have say hello. Seems okay to many students. But let's now use the 3 golden rules to go through this and see what we can correct. I'll give you a little clue. This word had here, there's no problem with it. The next lesson, in fact, is going to be all about the conditionals and simplifying your understanding of them and making your comprehension of it all much more efficient. But suffice to say, I'll just say that this word had here is fine. But it is an auxiliary verb. The auxiliary verb have, of course. And what do we know from rule number 2? We know that the next verb absolutely must be a past participle. So rule number 2, see, saw, seen. We're going to change saw to seen because of rule number 2. If I had seen you at the party, I would to have say hello. And now we've got the modal verb would. What do we know about modal verbs? They're always followed by a base form, right? Here we don't even have a verb. As you now know, we've got an infinitive. So we're going to remove that 2, and that leaves us with the base form have. And that's rule number 1. And now, although it's an auxiliary verb, have, it's a base form, but it's still a base form of the auxiliary verb have. The next verb, because of rule number 2, is going to be what? Well, it's got to be a past participle. So we're going to change say to say, said, said. I would have said hello, and that's because of rule number 2 once again. So there we have an example of a sentence that we're correcting using the 3 golden rules, and there's a great exercise with similar examples in your study guide. If you haven't done so already, please go to the website and download it for free. Yeah, have a go at that exercise. Okay, thanks for watching. Hopefully it's been a great help for you. And and we'll see you for the next lecture, which will be about the conditionals. Don't forget to download the study guides, and if you can, see if you can contribute a little something for my work. Thank you very much. Okay, in these appendices at the end of the lesson, I'm going to place some information that either I skipped over too quickly or I felt was perhaps unnecessarily deep for the lesson we've just had, but which still might be of use to many teachers out there. The first is quite simply that earlier I gave a brief list of modal verbs. I'm just going to write a full list of them now, just so there's no mistake. We've got can, could, may, might, will, would, must, shall, should, and ought to. I'd like you at this point to notice, contrary to what many people have been taught, contrary to what many books say, have to is not a modal verb. I want to quickly explain why. I mean, I'm going to come onto this in greater detail in a later lesson, but I'll quickly explain why with just one. There are several reasons, but here I'll give just one. If we say, I can, you can, he can. I may, you may, he may. I should, you should, he should. You'll notice that the modal verb does not change depending on what the subject is. However, if I start to use have to, I have to, you have to, he has to. You'll notice that has changed depending on if I'm using the first and second person or the third person, the I, you, or the he, she, it. So for that reason, and there are several others which I'll come to in a later lesson, have to is not a modal verb, but the others are, and there's an exhaustive list of them. The next appendix comes with a little bit of an apology, I'm afraid. It is this. Appendix 2. If we're being really honest, there are in fact only 8 tenses, not 12. The reason for this is that the future tenses, as we discussed earlier, all use the word will. We know will is what kind of verb? We know it now to be a modal verb. And so because of that, because we're not using an auxiliary, because we're not altering the main verb in any particular tense manner, we're just using an auxiliary verb in one of its meanings, they're not really tenses. However, I will say that it does suit our purposes far better to imagine that there are 12. We're going to count the 4 future tenses as if they were real tenses, and it will make things a lot easier a little bit later on. So that one comes with a bit of an apology. There are in fact only 8 tenses, not 12.